Yeah. Uh, for the Lateran Treaty, so that's what we were talking about. Like, how did the Vatican get these powers? So, for the longest time, Italy was not an independent country. It's like Germany too. Like these countries only were recognized as a whole nation by the end of the 1800s. So it's really recent. And Italy has always been split up by a whole bunch of different provinces, which were quite different. There was a lot of war that was ongoing in Italy. And if you notice the purple part of the Italian map, and of course it changes in size, throughout time, but
Right.
you had the Papal States. And people should know it was a emperor, I think it's Frederick II. He seems, from what I've looked into, a really good emperor. And it was during his time that the Papal States were putting pressure for the First Crusades. And he was the one who kind of went in, and according to how they say it, it was more of like a diplomatic thing to, just talk to people and everything. And they're like, hey, do you want to just say in words, that we have like jurisdiction over Jerusalem? And people should also know that most of the Christians who were speaking in Europe during this time, they were speaking Arabic because the
Right.
kingdom of Islam was actually super big. So in the case of Italy, Sicily, which you can see the island down below, that was a part of the Islamic Empire for over 7 centuries. So it was a very long time. Spain too, most of Spain under Al-Andalus was also part of the Islamic kingdom for again 7 to 5 centuries. The lower part of Spain was for pretty much 7 centuries. So this is a huge amount of influence, and most people, even the Christian kings that came into Spain, they were speaking Arabic.
Wow.
So anyway, when Emperor Frederick II comes back from these so-called crusades, the Papal States are ready to go to war with him. So you already see like the Papal States clearly are wanting to have this pitting against of cultures and religions. I'm not saying all of the popes were bad, by the way. There were a lot of good popes, but in terms of the bad popes, this was like a continual thing that they were trying to accomplish. So it's not really that surprising that it would be when Italy would get their independence, the Vatican was, because it had caused a lot of problems under its papal states. It had its own army, right? The
Right.
Papal States had its own army.
Wow.
So the Italy said, you're gonna just stay in your little box and we won't bug you, but you don't have a say in what's going on anymore in terms of Italy's government. And it was under Mussolini that the Vatican was pretty much, freed. And again, it's not to say that it's always a bad pope. In this case, the first pope that was there when the Vatican was given the status, he doesn't seem too bad because Pope Pius XI, because he did, do the 1931 encyclical, "We do not need to acquaint you," where he's criticizing fascist Italy. And then in 1937, he criticizes the Nazis with deep concern and the atheist communists under Divine Redeemer, both in 1937. So he's very outspoken, but with Pope Pius XII, he is the one that is infamous for never having criticized fascist Italy at all. This is also the Pope who begins the Vatican Bank, which is also known as the IOR, the Instituto per l'Opère de Religion, sorry.
I like it.
And he started that with his financial advisor to the Vatican, Bernardino Nogara. So as we're going to see, the Vatican Bank plays a huge central role in global drug trafficking in service to Gladio, which, if people don't know what Gladio is, I talk about it all the time.
Right.
Just refer to my Substack Through a Glass Darkly, Cynthia Chung, and look up Gladio, and you'll get tons of information. Because I'm too short on time for
No, that's okay.
otherwise.
Yeah.
So this is massive. Paul L. Williams, who wrote a fantastic book called Operation Gladio: The Unholy Alliance Between the Vatican, the CIA, and the Mafia. He writes about how so in World War II, you know, the mafia was like not very strong. It was actually on its way out in Italy as well. There are a lot of people who have validated that the mafia was not doing well. There's also this thing of like, oh yeah, the mafia was not getting along with the fascist Italians. That I don't find that is totally true, as we're going to see in a moment why that
Right.
doesn't fully make sense. But Luciano, Lucky Luciano, which is, you know,
Yeah.
the guy that kind of started what the mafia was known to be in the 20th century,
Right.
he was already in jail before World War II because he was found, they got him on the largest prostitution racketing, but it wasn't really prostitution. It was, what do you call it? It was like forceful prostitution. So basically it was human trafficking.
Right.
Human
Oh,
sex
wow.
trafficking is what he was implicated in, to be
Right.
clear here. These
Right.
women were not choosing, and he was also part of the heroin was to be used on these women. You drug these women up, you know,
Wow.
to
Yeah.
be treated this way. So his network in just New York for this human trafficking was so massive that they were able to get him in prison. And then the naval intelligence, they're like, oh, but we need Lucky Luciano to help win World War II. And we have the mafia that is in Italy that's fighting the fascists, and so we need to use the mafia. And as the story goes, according to Paul L. Williams, one of the people that they're talking to in Italy is Monsignor Giovanni Montini. This is the guy who would become Pope Paul the Sixth.
Oh,
Let me
wow.
validate that. Yeah, the sixth, Pope Paul the Sixth. So he was, in my opinion, one of the most infamous popes of the 20th century. He actually was a direct line from Pope Pius XII. He was a pro Secretary of State or something like that under Pope Pius XII, the Pope that didn't criticize fascist
Right.
Italy. So he
Exactly. He
was
was
taught,
captured.
it seems, from this guy.
Yeah.
It's a continuation of ideology. And so, according to Giovanni Montini, he recommends to the OSS that they get in touch with Don Carlo in Sicily, who has connections, very close connections with Lucky Luciano. That's why they made the excuse they need to talk to Lucky Luciano. And basically, through Operation Husky, the Allies go into Sicily. As the story goes, they go to the farm of Don Carlo, where he's held prison in his luxurious farm.
Right.
And then they get into tanks and they drive around Sicily. And somehow, this is how they capture Sicily. And then to reward them, the Allies give all of these mafia guys had positions in politics, like the mayors of all of these towns. And there is a lot of, witness accounts that have said that it was no better than fascist Italy, if not worse. And they killed a lot of the chief police chiefs and things like this. It was complete mayhem, and they were a reign of terror on the Italian people
Right.
as well. So, and the point being is that the mafia was on its way out. So
It was revived
it
by
was it was
time.
totally given back, but not
Right.
only that, the Sicily was going to be an instrumental location for the heroin trafficking. And
Wow.
when they say later on, this was also known as Operation Underworld, what Lucky Luciano was a part of with the naval intelligence and CIA. So when the war is over, they're like, oh, we need to reward Lucky Luciano. Let's free him. And then they deport him to Italy, even though he's an American citizen. And they're like, hey, here's Sicily for you. And then there are other people involved in this, but basically the mafia took over so many central locations that they were actually in charge of all of the major Italian ports in Italy that was used for black market trade with the Americans. And the CIA was clearly a part of this with drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, I'm sure human
Human.
trafficking.
Right.
And people have
So.
to realize that the term Pinocchio, that actually was a term that was like already known in New York for all of the missing children that basically were stolen from Italy, and they were brought to New York through mafia channels, and they were working for the mafia in various things. And it seems to be the start of what was child trafficking in the United States was through these Sicilian channels, and it was already known as Pinocchio. There was a very famous case of a 12-year-old who actually was very good with all of the details of his story. His father was known, like he filed a missing child report back in Italy, and the judges that were so corrupt in New York, and they said all of the witnesses are children. We're going to throw it out of court.
Oh,
But
wow.
all of the family was in Italy, and there was even proof that the father, didn't sell his child, because they were actually making the claim, oh, the father sold the child and thus it's legal.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Wow.
so there is a lot of problems that were coming out of this. Right, so Alexander Cockburn and Jeffrey St. Clair, their book Whiteout, it's a very good book. They're making the point here that at this point, no one can deny that the US intelligence agencies arranged for the release from prison of the world's preeminent drug lord, Lucky Luciano, allowed him to rebuild his narcotics empire. This was also the empire that would be carried on by Mayor Lansky. Mayor Lansky was the disciple of Lucky Luciano. Allowed him to rebuild his narcotics empire, watch the flow of drugs into the largely black ghettos of New York and Washington, D.C., escalate, then lied about what they had done. This founding saga of the relationship between American spies and gangsters set patterns that would be replicated from Laos and Burma to Marseille and Panama. And here's the big one that implicates the Vatican Bank is the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, which I don't know if people have heard of the infamous Roberto Calvi, who worked for Banco Ambrosiano, was found hung on the Blackfriars Bridge in London as one of the results, many deaths from the scandal that broke out. And it was found that the Vatican Bank had owned 8 shell companies. 6 out of 8 of these were in Panama. And I have the list here: Astolfine, United Trading Corporation, Erin, Bellatrix, Belrose, Starfield were in Panama. The 7th was in Luxembourg. The 8th was in Liechtenstein. And these were Luxembourg and Liechtenstein. It's like, they're kind of like Switzerland's.
Yeah.
That's why they're there. But very interesting that Panama is really a central spot for this drug money laundering. And so part of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal was that about 1.75 billion, which was around 1982 that this was lost, which is about 5.71 billion today.
Right.
It was lost through these shell companies. It was Marcinkus, who was the head of the Vatican Bank, and very high level member of the Vatican, even showed that the Vatican Bank did indeed own these shell companies, and ultimately there was nothing the Italian government could do. And to this day, we don't know where that 1.75 billion went. There's a lot of other money too that never went accounted for. And, authors like Paul L. Williams have made the point, it went to Gladio. It's not just, greedy priests that are spending it on their very, very luxurious, residences and gardens, which I'm sure have a lot of sketchy underground shit in their gardens, but it's also towards Gladio. And another thing that people should be aware of is the Nugan Hand Bank was implicated in a lot of these banks that started to tank, which totally devastated the Italian economy, but also like the European economy more broadly. And in 1980, the Nugan Hand Bank was liquidated. It owed 50 million to creditors. Nugan was found dead that year in his car, ruled as a suicide, though the angle that the rifle was shot was unlikely suicide. And oddly, one of the cards they found in his wallet was William Colby. Colby also has like very close connections to the Vatican. Colby would be found dead too, not long after. I'm not sure, over a year later, but over this something that happened where, he was eating, as the story goes, like oysters and white wine at his residence, and then gets up with his meal not even half finished and goes out into his boat into the lake and is never,
Right.
he just somehow drowns, and they look for his body for a week, and the body was actually right there by the dock the whole time. Like a very strange story.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, the other member was Michael Han, who was a Green Beret who served in Vietnam. And he fled Australia, went to the United States, and was never heard from again. So the Nguyen Han Bank was another bank that was caught up in drug money laundering that again has Vietnam connections. For the Vietnam thing, I don't have time to go over it too much in terms of the Jesuit connection to this and stuff, but people can refer again to my Substack
Yes.
through Glass Darkly. But one super interesting fact was No Ding Diem, who was the president that basically the Americans put in place of South Vietnam, which was a non-existent country until 2 seconds before. Like they didn't have a government system, tax system, police, nothing. He was actually exiled from Vietnam for several years. I don't take it very seriously because the Emperor Bao Dai, who was the Emperor of Vietnam, is the one who did it, but he was always a puppet. But anyway, so one of the places that he goes to besides the United States and Japan during his exile is to a Saint Benedict monastery in Belgium. And the Saint Benedict monastery is very interesting because it's connected with the Knights Templar, and the Knights Hospitallers were set up by the Benedictine order. And then, the Knights Hospitallers would later on become the Knights of Malta, which, most members of the CIA members, the kind of people we've been talking about, they're members of the Knights of Malta.
Right.
So this was all like going back to the First Crusade kind of stuff. Ignatius Loyola, who's the founder of the Jesuits, he would also, like Saint Benedict, isolate himself in a sacred cave over years and had a mystical experience which led to the founding of his order. And in the case of Loyola, it was in a Benedictine monastery, Our Lady of Montserrat in Spain, where he had his epiphany to start the Jesuit order. So again, very interesting connections that No Ding Diem, who was a very hard Catholic,
Was suddenly.
sort of militant Catholic, was now being in charge of Vietnam, the southern part, against the communists under Ho Chi Minh. And Colonel Prouty writes in his book, The CIA Vietnam and the Plot to Assassinate John F. Kennedy. So No Ding Diem arrives back from his exile, back to Saigon, Vietnam in June 26, 1954, meets Lansdale the next day, and starts his office July 7th after an election campaign carefully orchestrated by the CIA. So he becomes the president of South Vietnam, within a week of his arrival back from Saigon, Vietnam, and nobody knew who this guy was. He had family members who had a certain kind of high-level status within the Vatican as well. One of his brothers was his right-hand man that was in charge of basically the Green Beret trained militant, army that they had. But he had other relatives that were in the Catholic church at high level. This is just a picture from Prouty's book showing that the Saigon military mission, one of the things was they transported 1.1 million people from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, and they dumped most of them in South Vietnam with no ability to take care of themselves. So obviously that was going to increase crime and all sorts of things. But another thing that came out of this chaos was that it was said that all of these were Catholics. Probably not all of them, but a lot of them were Catholics. And these Catholics were then favored by No Dinh Diem, and they were given government positions within South Vietnam. And Lansdale, this whole time, he's very much the advisor to Diem. So pretty much all of the things that Diem is starting in terms of institution or actions is through Lansdale's, basically enforcing this. And there would be a lot of Orwellian titles that would come out of programs of South Vietnam. So I think that there probably is a connection to Tavistock, but again, I have to do the work for that. Such titles like Extended Arms for Brotherhood, Operation Brotherhood, Citizens Retraining Camp, Strategic Hamlets, Civic Action Program, People's Arms of Brotherhood, and the White Dove Resistance Sisters. These
Wow.
were like some of the
Yeah.
weird names that were
Yeah.
coming out of this. And I'm hitting the end.
No, they're great.
So for this, what do I need to read from this? This is basically just a quote telling people a little bit more about how the IOR, which is the Vatican Bank,
Right.
basically has, a kind of untouchable status. Marcinkus, again, the guy that I was naming with the 8 shell companies, and the Banco Ambrosiana scandal that like completely devastated the Italian economy. They've tried to arrest men like him in particular, and the Italian government has been told to go home.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Characters.
I can't see how the Vatican is not responsible for it because I'm not going to go over this in this presentation, but Operation Condor,
Right.
and this is what's interesting, right? Because you did have Catholics who were also attacked in
Right.
South America, but those were Catholics that I would say were Catholics who didn't want to go along with Gladio,
Right.
right? So you had priests, you had bishops, you had even cardinals who were resisting this. But I think that Operation Condor was because South America has been very heavily
Right.
Catholic. It
Yeah.
was a way to purge a lot of people. And Pope Francis, he was in Argentina during Operation Condor, and he wasn't Pope at the time. I can't remember his name before he was Pope Francis. And there were 2 Jesuit priests who were put through one of the major torture camp in Argentina. It was known as the biggest in all of South America. And I don't think that they were ever supposed to have been released, but they were released, half naked in the middle of the woods somewhere, and they were able to find civilization. And it's a hilarious story because Pope Francis is like, "Oh, I'm the one that got you out. I'm so happy that you're safe." And they're like, "No, you're the one who brought us to that torture camp. You're
Right.
responsible." Well, as Matt says, we never won World War II. We
Right.
allowed too many people to go underground to resurface later. And
Right.
there's no coincidence that the Nazis went to South America, the Catholic hub.
Right.
And this slide I have here of Libertas, this is just to show, like on the right is the Italian People Party Libertas. So
Right.
that was during the fascist Italy. It was compromised because you had so many fascists in it. So they did a rebranding and
Yes.
they kept the exact same symbol to
Right.
the left with the Crusader shield. It's known to be the Crusader shield, and it's supposed to be now the Christian
The red
Democrats.
shield. You can't.
And it's known to have still serviced Gladio. And so the fascists and the Vatican have always had a really close connection, and the mafia have always had a close connection as well to the Vatican. So this whole thing of the fascists and the mafia, like not ultimately getting along. If we look into things, the whole drug networks and everything, especially when you look into South America, well, this is the last slide, and that's actually perfect what you just said, that it never ended. So we're back to the Opium War connection. HSBC, the bank that was started to service the British Empire, the East India Trade Company, in its trade in opium, once they were able to enforce that onto China. HSBC is still functioning to this day. And in 2012, it was caught in a lot of problems. It actually had to pay the largest fine on record. It was like 1 point something billion. Oh, it's right there. $1.9 billion, which is actually, a fraction of their profits. So
I
it's
know.
not a deterrent at all.
I
But
know. I recently was talking about how much Chase has paid. I mean, billions of dollars in fines. And it's still. I mean, all of these banks.
and
It's unbelievable.
Chase, which is like Rockefeller,
Right.
it actually is in service to the Vatican. The Vatican actually owned massive shares in Chase Manhattan, and Chase Manhattan has been shown to hemorrhage funds in service to Gladio. So a lot of these banks are actually willing to.
And then they paid a fine, and then we bailed them out in 2008. To give them more power and shut down banks that were actually helping people.
Oh, it's so
Unbelievable.
terrible. Yeah, so in 2012, there is this U.S. Senate investigative panel, and this is where it gets, like, I find particularly upsetting. I mean, all of this is upsetting, but HSBC is also very much behind the Mexican narco gangs and terrorist financing. This is what the U.S. Senate investigative panel found. HSB implicated in. And if I go ahead, HSBC had allegedly laundered at least 881 million in drugs proceeds to international cartels, yada yada. 6 billion. Where is it? Okay, I'm gonna go to the very end here. Leopoldo Barroso, a former HSBC anti-money laundering director, told company officials in an exit interview that he was concerned about civil and criminal sanctions and that there were, quote, allegations of 60 to 70% of laundered proceeds in Mexico going through HSBC's affiliate, according to the U.S. Senate report. 60 to 70%. And Paul L. Williams also brings up, which I don't have the details off the top of my head, the clear implications of the CIA and even Fort Bragg. According to Paul L. Williams, these narco gangs were also trained partially at Fort Bragg before they went back into Mexico. But there are clear CIA connections as well to these narco gangs. And, you know, they're all, again, the CIA, HSBC, the Vatican, because the CIA, again, most of them are Knights of Malta, which
I know.
means, yeah, and, you know, like the Isle of Capri is still something that celebrities and
Right.
politicians and sorts are sent to. And it was a major cult center for centuries. And I think Emperor Tiberius, you know, has a lot to have started a bunch of weird occult, you know, practices in
Yeah.
Amalfi, which is where the Knights Hospitaller. Yeah, and I think, you know, there's probably a lot of they might feel, at least, you know, for a certain section of the world, that they've kind of won, they've succeeded, they've found the magic formula. Like the World War II formula was too direct, and they found a more, you know, subtle approach. Because you look at most of the stuff in our culture too, like what's on Netflix or what's
Right.
performed at the
Exactly.
Grammys, what's in
Right.
the music videos. It's like so over the top satanic at this point. And people are not really reacting enough to that. And I think that it's their hope that, you know, people can just worship, because at
Yeah.
the end of the day, they've always wanted to be worshipped
Right.
for what they are as this horrible entity. But again, it is like the words of the devil. Like the devil is for you to be able to do whatever you wish to do.
Right.
And in its first layer, that can seem like such an innocent thing. And that's why I think it's such a common phrase in society. It's like, I do what I want as long as it's not hurting anybody. But
Right.
is there really such a thing as doing something that's bad that isn't hurting anybody, because you're hurting yourself? And
Exactly.
if you're setting
Yes,
a standard
exactly.
in society, you are still hurting society. And I would say for people to not lose, you know, hope in this kind of situation, because it's, you know, it is the first time we've had such a technological society. Like it's an old force that we're
Right.
dealing with that wants to suppress and oppress the people, but it's a new situation in terms of the technological aspect. But I would say that because they don't understand what is the sacred in humans,
Right.
they don't actually know ultimately how to deal with the human psychology at a certain point. Like, unfortunately, the majority of people are going to be more easily led and this and that, but history has never been made by the masses who act like sheep. And even then, you know, you will have people who all of a sudden will wake up,
Yeah.
and you're like, how the fuck did that
Right.
person was asleep and then they woke up and they're
Right.
like now a force.
Yeah.
There's weird examples like that in history that have also occurred, but
Yeah.
they underestimate what is the human sacred, because they are wannabe gods, but it's all like you know, artificial at the end of the day. It's imposing, and it's our failure, our biggest failure in terms of the masses is that we are not aware. We just assume
Right.
too much, that that this couldn't possibly be true, and so
Exactly.
you allow it to creep like a frog in boiling water. That's the biggest problem, is that most people can't actually understand the mind of of evil.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's pretty simple. It's actually not anything, omnipotent or all knowing or wise. It's not wise at all. It's just obsessed. It's
Right.
obsessed with its agenda. And most people are not obsessed with, their agendas like this. Sure, and I wanted to add one point too to what you were saying that was so wonderful is, when the whole lockdown vaccine thing was happening, there was I thought the largest pushback that I could see was when it was starting to be enforced on children,
Yep.
and then the parents really started to stand up and say, "Listen, you're not going to touch my kid," kind of
Right.
thing. And I think that that's still a backbone that we can have as long as we protect that. I think that there's a lot of good that can come out of
I
that
agree.
kind of impulse. People can find my work on Through Glass Darkly, Cynthia Chung's Substack. And other than that, we have a nonprofit, me and my husband, Matthew Eric, called the Rising Tide Foundation. We have documentaries on our website too. And you can find that on risingtidefoundation.net.